I'm Emma Thompson, 25 years old, and I thought the worst part about having Crohn's disease was the physical pain. I was wrong. The worst part was discovering that my parents had stolen my $47,000 medical fund to pay for my brother's wedding and new house down payment, then acted like I was being selfish for needing my life-saving medication. When my father looked me in the eye and said, "Family means making sacrifices for each other," I knew I had to make a choice. Either I could quietly suffer and potentially die from lack of treatment, or I could expose every dirty secret this family had buried for decades. What my parents didn't count on was that my new sister-in-law, Jessica, was a nurse who understood exactly how serious my condition was, and she had no tolerance for people who put money before medical needs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Riverside, Ohio, our family looked like the picture of suburban success. My father, Bob, worked as an insurance claims adjuster downtown, driving his reliable Honda Civic to work every morning at 8 sharp. My mother, Linda, kept books for Dr. Martinez's dental practice 3 days a week, spending her other time maintaining our 2-story colonial home in the Maple Heights subdivision. Our lawn was always perfectly mowed, our driveway pressure washed, and our holiday decorations the envy of the neighborhood. Bob and Linda Thompson were the kind of parents who attended every PTA meeting, volunteered for the annual block party, and never missed church on Sunday morning. To anyone watching from the outside, we were the embodiment of middle-class stability. My father had worked his way up from entry-level positions to become a senior adjuster with his company, earning enough to afford our mortgage and 2 car payments while building what he called a solid foundation for the family. My mother supplemented their income with her part-time work, and her meticulous attention to detail with numbers made her invaluable to Dr. Martinez's practice. They had married right out of high school, worked hard through their 20s, and by their 40s had achieved what they considered the American dream. But inside our home, a different dynamic ruled every interaction. My older brother Mike had always been the star of our family constellation. At 28, he possessed the kind of effortless charm that made people gravitate toward him. In high school, he had been the starting quarterback, homecoming king, and class president. His bedroom walls were covered with trophies, medals, and photographs of him scoring touchdowns or accepting awards. Teachers loved him, coaches recruited him, and his friends' parents always commented on what a polite, well-mannered young man he was. Mike's success continued into adulthood. After college, he landed a sales position with a pharmaceutical company that paid well and came with an impressive company car. He wore tailored suits, attended conferences in major cities, and always seemed to have exciting stories about client dinners and business trips. When he brought girlfriends home, my parents treated them like visiting royalty, asking about their families, their careers, their plans with Mike. My mother would spend hours preparing elaborate meals, and my father would bring out his best scotch for after-dinner conversations. I, on the other hand, had always been what my parents called the responsible one, which I gradually realized was code for the one we don't have to worry about impressing anyone. While Mike's achievements were celebrated with family dinners and bragging calls to relatives, my accomplishments were acknowledged with brief nods and reminders not to get too proud of myself. When I graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State with a degree in communications, my parents attended the ceremony but spent most of the lunch afterward talking about Mike's latest promotion. When I won a scholarship for academic excellence, my father's response was, "Well, that's what we expect from you." The difference in treatment became even more apparent when I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease at 16. The diagnosis came after months of unexplained stomach pain, fatigue, and weight loss that had left me feeling miserable and confused. Dr. Wells, the gastroenterologist at Columbus Specialty Clinic, explained that Crohn's was a chronic inflammatory bowel disease that would require lifelong management and could be both unpredictable and expensive to treat. The financial reality of my condition hit our family immediately. Even with my father's insurance coverage, the specialized medications I needed cost thousands of dollars each month. The biological treatments that controlled my information carried price tags that made my parents visibly wince. Regular colonoscopies, blood work, and specialist visits added up to what felt like mortgage payments dedicated solely to keeping me functional. But rather than treating this as a family crisis that required everyone's support, my parents approached my illness with a mixture of resentment and strategic planning that left me feeling like a financial burden. Emma's medical situation, as they called it, became a constant stressor that influenced every family decision. Vacations were canceled because of Emma's medical situation. Restaurant dinners became rare because of Emma's medical situation. Mike's requests for help with college expenses were met with tight smiles and explanations about Emma's medical situation. My father, with his insurance background, immediately began researching ways to manage the financial impact of my condition. He opened a dedicated savings account that he called Emma's Medical Fund, and both parents began contributing a portion of their paychecks each month. My mother started bringing home extra bookkeeping work from other small businesses, and my father took on weekend consulting projects with other insurance companies. They made it clear that these sacrifices were being made specifically for my medical needs. At first, I felt grateful for their efforts. Knowing that my parents were working extra hours and cutting back on their own comforts to ensure I could receive proper treatment made me feel supported, even if their approach seemed businesslike rather than nurturing. I tried to be the perfect patient, never complaining about side effects, always taking my medications exactly as prescribed, and doing everything possible to avoid expensive emergency room visits. But as the years passed, I began to notice that my medical fund had become a tool of emotional manipulation. Whenever I wanted something that cost money, whether it was new clothes, school supplies, or social activities with friends, my parents would remind me of how much they were paying for my medical care. They made it clear that my physical health came at any cost, even if it meant limiting my own experiences or putting my happiness on hold.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
We're sacrificing for my medical care. Do you realize how much money we put away for your health every month? Became a common refrain. We can't afford extras when we're already stretched thin with your medications. The message was clear and consistent. I was expensive, I was a drain on family resources, and any additional requests I made were evidence of selfishness and ingratitude. My medical needs had transformed me from a daughter into a line item in the family budget, and not a particularly welcome one. Mike, meanwhile, continued to receive financial support for his various endeavors without any mention of family financial constraints. When he wanted to attend an expensive summer baseball camp in high school, my parents found the money. When he needed a car for college, they co-signed a loan and helped with the payments. When he wanted to take spring break trips with friends, they contributed to the costs. None of these expenditures were ever weighed against the family medical fund or presented as competing with my healthcare needs. The inequity became even more stark after Mike's college graduation. While I was living in a tiny apartment and working part-time jobs to supplement my minimal spending money, Mike was receiving regular loans from my parents that everyone understood would never be repaid. When he wanted to lease a newer car, my parents helped with the down payment. When he needed professional clothes for his sales job, my mother took him shopping and paid for an entire wardrobe. When he started dating Jessica seriously and wanted to take her on expensive dates, my father would slip him money just to help out. Every time I witnessed these transactions, I felt a familiar mixture of hurt and confusion. The same parents who scrutinized every penny of my medical expenses and made me feel guilty for needing treatment seemed to have unlimited resources when it came to maintaining Mike's lifestyle and image. But whenever I tried to bring up this disparity, my parents would redirect the conversation back to how much they were already doing for me. "We're not keeping score here, Emma," my mother would say whenever I pointed out the difference in treatment. "Mike works hard and deserves to enjoy his success. Besides, we are already putting hundreds of dollars aside for you every month. That's more than most parents would do." My father's response was typically more direct. "Mike doesn't cost us $3,000 a month just to stay healthy," he would say. "Different children have different needs, and we address them accordingly. Your need happens to be medical care, and we provide that." Their logic seemed reasonable on the surface, but it ignored the emotional impact of being constantly reminded that I was a financial burden while watching my brother receive what appeared to be unlimited financial support for his wants rather than needs.
More troubling was the growing realization that my parents seemed to view my medical fund not as money dedicated to my healthcare, but as their contribution to the family that could be redirected if they deemed other priorities more important. This became apparent during my junior year of college when I had a severe flare-up that required hospitalization and a change in medications. The new treatment protocol was even more expensive than my previous regimen, and my insurance company initially denied coverage for the newer drug. While we fought the insurance decision, I needed to pay out of pocket for the medication to avoid a dangerous gap in treatment. When I called my parents to ask if we could use some of the medical fund to cover the temporary costs, my father hesitated in a way that made my stomach drop. "Let me check the balance and get back to you," he said, which seemed like an odd response given that this was exactly the situation the fund was designed for. That phone call was my first indication that something might be wrong with my medical fund, but I was too sick and overwhelmed with college responsibilities to investigate further. My parents did cover the medication costs, and once my insurance approved the new treatment, we returned to the regular monthly routine of expensive but covered prescriptions. It wasn't until after my college graduation, when I was trying to plan my post-graduation healthcare transition, that I discovered the full extent of what had been happening with my medical fund. I had moved back to Riverside temporarily while job searching, sleeping in my childhood bedroom and trying to figure out my next steps. My Crohn's was well controlled at that point, but I knew I would need to carefully manage the transition from my parents' insurance to my own coverage once I found full-time employment. During a conversation about my healthcare options, I asked my father about the current balance in my medical fund, thinking it might provide a cushion during my job search period. His response was evasive, in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "The fund is doing fine," he said, without making eye contact. "Don't worry about the details. We'll make sure you have what you need." That non-answer was so unlike my father's usual detailed financial explanations that I knew something was seriously wrong. Bob Thompson was the kind of man who could tell you exactly how much he spent on gasoline each month and whether his coffee expenses were trending up or down compared to the previous quarter. He didn't give vague answers about money unless he was hiding something. That night, I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out why my father would be secretive about my medical fund. The money had been specifically designated for my healthcare needs, contributed to monthly by both parents for nearly 9 years. Even after accounting for my medical expenses, the balance had reached nearly $50,000 by the time I graduated from high school. But starting in my freshman year of college, the withdrawals began. Not for my medical care, but for what the bank statements revealed to be transfers to Mike's checking account. $5,000 when he needed a security deposit for his first apartment. $8,000 for what the memo line called vehicle assistance. $12,000 labeled simply family loan. The pattern continued throughout my college years with regular
transfers from my medical fund to Mike's accounts that coincided with major expenses in his life. A $10,000 withdrawal the month he graduated from college, $15,000 around the time he started his sales job and needed professional clothes and equipment, another $8,000 when he moved to a more expensive apartment closer to his office. Each withdrawal was documented in my father's meticulous record-keeping, but none had been discussed with me or presented as temporary loans from my medical fund. According to the statements, my parents had quietly redistributed nearly $40,000 of my medical money to support Mike's lifestyle and career development. The final, devastating discovery was a withdrawal from just 6 months earlier. $22,000, the largest single transfer in the account's history, made 3 days before Mike's wedding to Jessica. The memo line read, "Family celebration expenses." But I knew exactly what this money had funded. Mike and Jessica's wedding had been an elaborate affair at the Riverside Country Club, with a reception for 200 guests, an open bar, and a honeymoon in Hawaii that Mike had posted about extensively on social media. Sitting in my father's office chair, staring at the bank statements that documented years of betrayal, I felt something break inside me. Not just trust, but the fundamental assumption that my parents saw me as an equal member of the family, deserving of the same consideration they gave Mike. The medical fund hadn't been created to ensure my healthcare security. It had been created as a convenient source of money for Mike whenever he needed financial help, with my medical needs serving as justification for my parents to work extra hours and save money they had always intended to spend on their golden child. The current balance in my medical fund was $3,247.18. Less than the cost of 2 months of my medication, and barely enough to cover a single emergency room visit if my Crohn's flared up unexpectedly. I sat in that office for 3 hours, reading through every statement and document related to my medical fund, trying to understand how my parents had justified this betrayal to themselves. In my father's handwriting, I found notes that revealed their reasoning. Mike's career investment, read one notation next to a large withdrawal. Supporting family success, read another. Emma's medication stable, fund available for family needs, was written next to the wedding withdrawal. They had convinced themselves that supporting Mike's career and lifestyle was a family investment that would ultimately benefit everyone, including me. In their minds, helping Mike succeed was more important than maintaining my medical security, because his success would reflect well on the family and potentially provide him with resources to help me later if needed. But what made their betrayal even more painful was the realization that they had continued to make me feel guilty about my medical expenses and treatment costs, even while they were systematically stealing the money that was supposed to ensure my healthcare security. Every time they reminded me of how much my condition cost the family, every time they made me feel like a burden for needing expensive medications, they were lying to my face about where that money was actually going. The sound of the garage door opening interrupted my investigation. My parents were returning from work, and I quickly gathered the statements and returned them to their files. I needed time to process what I had discovered and decide how to respond. But one thing was immediately clear. I could no longer trust my parents to prioritize my health and safety, and I could no longer pretend that their treatment of Mike and me was simply different parenting styles rather than deliberate favoritism. That evening at dinner, I watched my parents with new eyes as they discussed their day and asked about my job search progress. They seemed so normal, so concerned about my welfare, so invested in my success. But I now knew that behind their caring facade was a willingness to jeopardize my health for Mike's convenience and a sophisticated system of lies designed to hide their betrayal. When my father asked if I had given any more thought to my post-graduation healthcare planning, I almost laughed at the irony. Actually, I was wondering about the medical fund, I said carefully. I might need to use some of that money to bridge my insurance coverage when I start a new job. My parents exchanged a look that I now recognized as panic. Let's not worry about that right now, my mother said quickly. We'll figure something out when the time comes. But shouldn't we know how much is available? I pressed. I'd like to understand my options. My father cleared his throat. The fund is managed as part of our overall financial planning, Emma. You don't need to worry about the specific details. We'll make sure you're covered. Their evasiveness confirmed what the bank statements had already revealed. They knew exactly what they had done with my money, and they had no intention of admitting it or stopping their pattern of prioritizing Mike's wants over my needs. That night, I made a decision that would ultimately change the trajectory of my entire family. I wasn't going to confront my parents directly or demand explanations they would never give honestly. Instead, I was going to ensure that the truth about my family's financial priorities became impossible for them to hide from the one person whose opinion they actually cared about, my brother's new wife, Jessica. Part 2. Character dynamics and role assignment. Understanding how my family operated required recognizing the carefully constructed roles each of us had been assigned from childhood. Roles that had calcified over the years into an unbreakable hierarchy that governed every interaction and decision.
These weren't organic family dynamics that had evolved naturally, but rather a deliberate system that my parents had created and maintained to ensure their own comfort and Mike's continued elevation above all other considerations. Mike's position as the golden child wasn't simply about being the older sibling, or even about his natural charisma and athletic abilities. It was about how my parents had systematically created an environment where his needs, wants, and feelings took precedence over everyone else's, including their own. From the earliest day I could remember, Mike's emotional state determined the mood of our entire household. If Mike was happy, my parents were relaxed and generous. If Mike was frustrated or disappointed, everyone had to adjust their behavior to restore his equilibrium. This dynamic played out in countless small ways that shaped our family culture. When Mike came home from school upset about a bad grade or a conflict with friends, dinner conversation would revolve around validating his feelings and
strategizing solutions. My mother would prepare his favorite meal, my father would offer advice and encouragement, and I would be expected to listen sympathetically and offer supportive comments. If I had experienced something difficult during my own day, I quickly learned that bringing it up during Mike's crisis moments was considered selfish and inappropriate. The message was clear and consistently reinforced. Mike's problems were family problems that required collective attention and resources. Everyone else's problems were individual responsibilities that shouldn't burden the family unit. This wasn't explicitly stated as family policy, but it was demonstrated so consistently that questioning it seemed as pointless as questioning gravity. My father's relationship with Mike was particularly revealing of how these dynamics operated. Bob Thompson was not naturally an emotional or demonstrative man, but with Mike, he became animated and engaged in ways I rarely witnessed otherwise. They would spend hours discussing Mike's football strategies, his college plans, his career ambitions, and his relationship challenges. My father would offer detailed advice, share stories from his own youth, and express genuine pride in Mike's accomplishments and potential. When Mike started his pharmaceutical sales career, my father became his unofficial business mentor, helping him understand corporate politics, salary negotiations, and client relationship management. They would have lengthy phone conversations about Mike's work challenges, with my father offering insights from his own professional experience and connecting Mike with contacts who might be helpful for his career advancement. These mentoring sessions weren't presented as favoritism, but rather as natural father-son bonding around shared interests in business and success. The problem was that my father showed no similar interest in my academic achievements, career planning, or professional development. When I tried to engage him in conversations about my communications studies or my interest in nonprofit work, his responses were polite but perfunctory. He would nod appropriately and offer generic encouragement, but he never demonstrated the passionate investment in my success that he showed regarding Mike's career. My mother's relationship with Mike was equally illuminating, though it manifested differently than my father's mentorship approach. Linda Thompson treated Mike like a beloved guest in our home, rather than a family member with normal responsibilities and expectations. She anticipated his needs, accommodated his preferences, and shielded him from any discomfort or inconvenience that family life might typically involve. When Mike lived at home during college summers, my mother would do his laundry, clean his room, and prepare special meals based on his requests. She would rearrange her work schedule to accommodate his social plans, drive him places when his car was being serviced, and handle any administrative tasks he found tedious or time-consuming. This wasn't presented as special treatment, but rather as natural maternal care for a son who was working hard and deserving of support. The contrast with her approach to my needs was stark and painful. I was expected to manage my own laundry, cleaning, and meal preparation from a much younger age. When I needed transportation, it was my responsibility to find alternatives or arrange my schedule around my mother's availability. Administrative tasks related to my medical care, insurance claims, and prescription management became my responsibility as soon as I was old enough to handle them, with my mother offering minimal assistance and frequent reminders that I needed to learn independence. Again, this differential treatment was justified through seemingly reasonable explanations. I was more responsible and better organized than Mike, so I could handle more independence. Mike was busy with important career development, while I was just in school and had more flexible time. These explanations made the favoritism sound like logical resource allocation rather than emotional preference, but the underlying message was unmistakable. The role I had been assigned within this family system was that of the low-maintenance child who shouldn't require significant attention, resources, or emotional energy from my parents. I was supposed to be grateful for the basics of food, shelter, and medical care, while understanding that anything beyond those necessities was a luxury that might interfere with more important family priorities, specifically Mike's comfort and advancement. This role assignment became particularly cruel when combined with my chronic illness. Having Crohn's disease meant that I inherently required more medical attention, more expensive care, and more logistical management than a healthy child would need. But rather than adjusting their expectations to accommodate my legitimate additional needs, my parents seemed to resent that my illness prevented me from fulfilling my assigned role of the easy, uncomplicated child. Every symptom flare, every medication adjustment, every specialist appointment, and every insurance complication was treated as evidence that I was failing to maintain my expected position as the family member who didn't cause problems. The fact that my medical needs were involuntary and necessary for my survival didn't seem to matter. What mattered was that my illness disrupted their preferred family dynamic, where Mike received attention and resources while I remained quietly self-sufficient in the background. The psychological impact of this role assignment was profound and lasting. I learned to minimize my own needs, suppress my emotional responses, and prioritize other people's comfort over my own well-being. When I experienced pain from my Crohn's symptoms, I learned to suffer silently rather than asking for help or accommodation that might inconvenience others. When I achieved academic or personal successes, I learned to celebrate quietly rather than expecting recognition that might divert attention from Mike's accomplishments. Most damaging was the way I internalized the message that my value to my family was inversely related to how much trouble I caused or resources I required. The more independent and undemanding I could be, the more worthy I was of love and acceptance. The more my illness required attention or expense, the more I was failing in my fundamental family role. This psychological conditioning made it particularly difficult for me to advocate for myself or recognize when I was being treated unfairly. When Mike received financial support, gifts, or special treatment, my automatic response was to assume he deserved these benefits more than I did. When my own requests for help or accommodation were denied or met with resistance, my automatic response was to question whether I was being unreasonable, rather than questioning whether my parents were being unfair. The most insidious aspect of these assigned roles was how they were presented as natural family dynamics, rather than deliberate choices my parents had made about how to distribute their attention and resources. Mike wasn't receiving preferential treatment. He was just more successful and therefore naturally warranted more support. I wasn't being neglected. I was just more independent and therefore naturally required less assistance. These explanations allowed my parents to maintain their self-image as fair and loving while systematically prioritizing one child's needs over another's. They could feel good about their parenting choices because they had convinced themselves that they were simply responding appropriately to their children's different personalities and circumstances, rather than creating and reinforcing those differences through their own behavior. The medical fund theft I had discovered was the logical extension of these established family roles. Mike needed money for his wedding and house down payment, which my parents categorized as important family investments worthy of support. I needed money for ongoing medical care, which my parents had apparently recategorized as a less pressing family priority that could be postponed or managed through other means. In their minds, they weren't stealing my medical money to give to Mike. They were reallocating family resources to support the family member whose success and happiness they had always prioritized, while trusting that the family member assigned the role of low maintenance and self-sufficient would find a way to manage without creating problems for anyone else. Part 3. Historical Pattern and Escalation Timeline. The systematic favoritism I discovered through the medical fund theft wasn't an isolated incident or a recent development,
but rather the culmination of decades of preferential treatment that had grown more pronounced and financially significant over time. Looking back with the clarity that comes from understanding the scope of my parents' deception, I could trace a clear pattern of escalating inequality that had started small and grown into the massive betrayal I now faced. The earliest incidents I could remember were subtle enough that I had dismissed them as normal family dynamics or coincidental differences in treatment. When Mike was 8 and I was 5, he received a brand new bicycle for his birthday, while I received a refurbished one from a garage sale several months later. When Mike wanted to join Little League, my parents immediately signed him up and bought all the required equipment. When I expressed interest in gymnastics classes the following year, my parents explained that the family budget was tight and suggested I try activities at the community center instead. These early disparities were always accompanied by reasonable explanations that made questioning them seem petty and ungrateful. Mike's bicycle was more expensive because boys' bikes cost more than girls' bikes. Little League was an investment in Mike's athletic development that might lead to scholarship opportunities. Gymnastics was just a hobby that wasn't worth significant expense when free alternatives were available. As children, we accepted these explanations because we had no basis for comparison or understanding of family budgets. It wasn't until years later that I realized how convenient it was that financial constraints only seemed to apply to my activities and interests, never to Mike's. The pattern became more apparent during our teenage years when the financial stakes increased and the disparities became harder to disguise with creative explanations. Mike's senior year, my parents hired a private SAT tutor to help improve his college entrance scores, spending nearly $2,000 on test preparation. When I took the SATs 2 years later, I was given a prep book and told to study on my own. Mike's college application process included visits to multiple universities, professional assistance with his essays, and application fees that totaled over $500. My college applications were limited to schools within driving distance, and I was responsible for researching programs and writing essays without professional help. The justification for these disparities evolved as Mike and I grew older, but the underlying logic remained consistent. Mike was the athlete who needed specialized support to reach his potential, while I was the academic who should be able to succeed through individual effort. Mike had leadership qualities that warranted investment, while I was naturally studious and didn't require external assistance to achieve my goals. These characterizations weren't entirely inaccurate, but they were used selectively to justify predetermined spending decisions rather than objectively assess our respective needs. Mike did have athletic talent, but he also struggled academically and could have benefited from the same tutoring support he received for athletics. I was academically capable, but I also would have benefited from the college counseling and test preparation that Mike received. The difference was that my parents had decided Mike's success was a family priority worthy of significant investment, while my success was an individual responsibility that shouldn't require substantial family resources. This wasn't a decision based on our respective potentials or needs, but rather a predetermined allocation of attention and money that reflected their emotional preferences rather than practical assessments. College years brought the most financially significant examples of this favoritism, though they were disguised as loans and temporary assistance that created the illusion of fairness while maintaining the reality of preferential treatment. Mike's college expenses included not only tuition and room and board, but also a generous monthly allowance, spring break trips, fraternity dues, and social activities that my parents funded without requiring detailed accounting or repayment plans.
Money for anything related to his college experience, the process was simple and immediate. He would call home, explain what he needed, and receive either a direct transfer or a check in the mail within days. These transactions were described as helping Mike focus on his studies and investing in his future success, rather than ongoing financial support that other families might not provide. My college experience operated under completely different financial rules. I received the basic tuition and room and board payments, but any additional expenses required detailed justification and were often denied or provided with strings attached. When I needed money for textbooks, I was told to buy used copies or borrow from the library. When I wanted to attend professional conferences or academic programs that could enhance my resume, I was told these were optional expenses that I should fund through part-time work. The contrast was particularly stark during semester breaks and summer vacations. Mike's breaks were treated as opportunities for rest and recreation, with my parents funding trips, social activities, and entertainment that allowed him to recharge before returning to school. My breaks were expected to be productive, income-generating periods where I worked full-time to contribute to my own college expenses and reduce the family's financial burden. Again, these different expectations were justified through seemingly logical explanations. Mike's demanding athletic schedule meant he needed real breaks to recover physically and mentally. My academic focus meant I could benefit from work experience that would enhance my resume and teach valuable life skills. But the underlying message was unmistakable. Mike deserved leisure and support, while I deserved work and responsibility. The post-college period brought the most egregious examples of financial favoritism, including the medical fund theft I had recently discovered. But even before that ultimate betrayal, there had been numerous smaller incidents that should have warned me about my parents' willingness to prioritize Mike's comfort over my security. When Mike graduated from college and started his sales career, my parents provided him with what they called transition support that included security deposits for his apartment, professional wardrobe assistance, and car payment help during his first year of employment. This support was presented as a temporary investment in Mike's career launch that would help him establish himself professionally and become financially independent more quickly. When I graduated from college and struggled to find full-time employment in my field, I received advice about lowering my expectations and accepting whatever work was available. There was no transition support, no assistance with apartment deposits or professional wardrobe development, and no car payment help, despite the fact that my older, less reliable vehicle made job searching significantly more difficult. The explanation for this disparity was that Mike's career in sales required immediate professional presentation and mobility that justified short-term family investment, while my communications background provided more flexibility and employment options that didn't require the same level of financial support. The reality was that my parents had decided Mike's career success was worth ongoing family investment, while my career development was my individual responsibility regardless of the challenges I faced. Throughout this escalating pattern of preferential treatment, my medical needs had been used as both justification for my parents' extra work and sacrifice and as an excuse for why I couldn't receive the same level of support Mike enjoyed. The medical fund represented years of my parents working additional hours and taking on extra projects, sacrifices they reminded me of regularly to ensure I understood how much my condition cost the family. But those same medical needs were also used to explain why I couldn't receive help with other expenses. Money that might have supported my college activities, career development, or post-graduation transition was already committed to my healthcare costs. I should be grateful for the medical support and understand that it precluded other forms of assistance that healthy children might expect from their families. This dual use of my medical needs as both evidence of my parents' sacrifice and justification for their lack of support in other areas was particularly manipulative. It created a situation where I felt simultaneously guilty about the expense I caused the family and resentful about the opportunities I was denied because of that expense. I couldn't ask for additional help without seeming ungrateful for the medical support I received, but I also couldn't ignore the stark difference between my experience and Mike's. The medical fund theft represented the ultimate escalation of this pattern. My parents had moved beyond simply denying me equal treatment to actively stealing money that had been designated specifically for my healthcare needs. They had taken the very foundation of my medical security and redistributed it to support Mike's lifestyle improvements, all while continuing to make me feel guilty about the cost of my medical care. Part 4. Escalating pattern through years. The years following my discovery of the medical fund theft revealed just how deep and systematic my parents' deception had become, and how skillfully they had hidden not just the financial betrayal, but an entire parallel system of support for Mike that operated completely outside any family budget discussions or transparency. What I had initially understood as favoritism was actually a comprehensive program of financial support that had been funded, at least partially, through the systematic diversion of resources that should have been protecting my health and future. My investigation into our family's financial records, conducted in careful segments whenever my parents were away from the house, revealed a pattern of money movement that was far more sophisticated and deliberate than I had initially realized. The medical fund wasn't the only account that had been raided to support Mike's lifestyle and career advancement. My parents had created an intricate web of transfers, loans, and gifts that effectively funneled money from various sources toward Mike while maintaining the appearance of normal family budgeting. The most shocking discovery was a series of transfers from my mother's retirement account that coincided with major milestones in Mike's life. When he graduated from college, my mother had withdrawn $15,000 from her 401k, paying significant penalties and taxes to provide him with what she called launch capital for his adult life. When he started his pharmaceutical sales job and needed a reliable car for client visits, she had borrowed against her retirement savings to help him secure financing for a new SUV.
Retirement account raids were never mentioned in family financial discussions, and they represented a level of long-term sacrifice for Mike's benefit that went far beyond normal parental support. My mother was literally compromising her own financial security in retirement to ensure Mike's immediate comfort and success, while simultaneously complaining about the financial burden my medical needs placed on the family. The documentation I found in my father's files revealed that he had been equally creative in finding resources to support Mike's lifestyle. Bob had taken on numerous weekend consulting projects over the years, presenting them to the family as necessary work to cover household expenses and my medical costs. But the invoices and payment records showed that the majority of this additional income had been directed toward Mike's various needs and wants, rather than general family expenses or medical fund contributions. When Mike had wanted to attend expensive professional development conferences for his sales career, my father had worked extra projects to cover the costs. When Mike had needed help with the security deposit and first month's rent for his upscale apartment, my father had taken on additional insurance consulting work specifically to provide those funds. When Mike had wanted to join an exclusive golf club where many of his pharmaceutical company clients were members, my father had worked overtime for months to cover the membership fees and equipment costs. All of this additional work and sacrifice was presented to our family as evidence of my parents' strong work ethic and dedication to providing for their children's needs. But the reality was that they were working extra hours specifically to support Mike's lifestyle and career advancement, while using my medical expenses as the public justification for their increased work schedules. The emotional manipulation involved in this deception was particularly cruel. Every time my parents complained about being tired from working extra hours, every time they mentioned having to take on additional projects to make ends meet, and every time they reminded me of the financial sacrifices they were making for my medical care, they were actually describing work they were doing to support Mike's preferences and ambitions. I had spent years feeling guilty about the burden my medical needs placed on my parents, watching them work longer hours and take on additional stress to ensure I could receive proper treatment. Now I understood that much of that additional work was actually being done to maintain Mike's standard of living, while my medical fund was being systematically depleted to cover expenses that should have been funded through those extra consulting projects.
The timeline of major transfers from my medical fund corresponded almost exactly with significant events in Mike's adult life, creating a clear pattern that showed how my parents had substituted my healthcare money for the extra income they were generating through additional work. When Mike had needed help with his apartment security deposit, instead of using money from my father's consulting work, my parents had transferred funds from my medical account and used the consulting income for other purposes. This pattern continued throughout Mike's career development and personal milestones. Rather than using the additional income they generated specifically for Mike's needs, they would transfer money from my medical fund and redirect their extra earnings toward other expenses or savings goals. The result was that Mike received the same level of support he would have gotten if my parents had been honestly funding his lifestyle, but the cost was being borne by my future medical security rather than their current sacrifice. The wedding expenses provided the most dramatic example of this systematic deception. The $22,000 that had been transferred from my medical fund to pay for Mike's wedding represented not just a massive theft of my healthcare money, but also a deliberate choice to prioritize a single day of celebration over years of my medical security. But the wedding expenses I discovered were even more extensive than the single large transfer I had initially found. My father's record showed additional payments for wedding-related costs that had been funded through his consulting work, my mother's retirement account withdrawals, and even a personal loan my parents had taken against their house. The total family investment in Mike's wedding had exceeded $40,000, making it by far the largest single expense my parents had ever undertaken for any purpose. The documentation around these wedding expenses was particularly revealing because it showed how my parents had planned and justified the use of my medical fund for Mike's celebration. In my father's handwritten notes, I found calculations showing that my medical expenses had been relatively low for the previous 18 months due to my stable condition and effective medication regimen. Based on this temporary period of lower costs, my father had determined that my medical fund contained surplus money that could be, quote, temporarily reallocated for family priorities. The logic was breathtakingly callous. Because my chronic illness had been well controlled for a relatively short period, my parents had decided that the money saved for my future medical emergencies was available for Mike's wedding expenses. They had gambled with my health security based on recent stability, ignoring the unpredictable nature of Crohn's disease and the possibility that my condition could worsen at any time. Even more disturbing was the evidence that my parents had consulted with Mike about using my medical fund for his wedding expenses. Phone records and email exchanges showed that Mike had been aware of the source of his wedding funding and had actively participated in discussions about how much money could be safely taken from my healthcare account without compromising my immediate medical needs. This meant that Mike's expressions of concern about my health and his offers to help with medical expenses if needed weren't genuine gestures of brotherly support, but rather attempts to manage his own guilt about participating in the theft of my medical security. He knew that his wedding had been funded partly through money designated for my health care, and he had collaborated with my parents in justifying and concealing that theft. The discovery that Mike had been an active participant in the medical fund deception rather than an unknowing beneficiary changed my understanding of our entire family dynamic. This wasn't simply a case of parents showing favoritism toward one child while neglecting another. This was a deliberate conspiracy involving 3 family members who had agreed to prioritize Mike's lifestyle and milestones over my own
Health and security. The email exchanges between Mike and my parents revealed ongoing discussions about how much money could be taken from my medical fund without creating obvious problems, how to time withdrawals to coincide with periods when my medical expenses were lower, and how to manage the situation if I asked questions about the account balance. These weren't impulsive decisions made in moments of financial pressure, but carefully planned strategies for redirecting my healthcare money toward Mike's benefit. Reading these exchanges felt like discovering that my entire family had been living double lives, presenting themselves as loving and supportive while secretly collaborating to undermine my medical security for Mike's advantage. The casual tone of their discussions about taking my money was particularly painful, as if my healthcare fund was simply another family resource they could allocate according to their preferences, rather than a critical safety net for my chronic illness. The documentation also revealed that this systematic deception had been ongoing for much longer than I had initially realized. Small transfers from my medical fund had been occurring regularly for nearly 4 years, carefully timed and sized to avoid detection, while gradually reducing my healthcare security to fund Mike's various needs and wants. Part 5. The Forced Return Catalyst Setup. The months following my college graduation had been a period of cautious optimism as I navigated the transition from student life to independent adulthood while managing my Crohn's disease and job search simultaneously. I had moved into a small studio apartment in downtown Riverside, using my modest savings to secure a place that was walking distance from potential employers and close enough to my parents' house for occasional family dinners, without being dependent on their daily support or oversight. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing what it felt like to make decisions based purely on my own preferences and needs, rather than constantly considering how my choices might affect family dynamics or Mike's comfort. My tiny apartment was furnished with secondhand pieces and garage sale finds, but every item reflected my personal taste rather than family compromise. I could eat meals at whatever time suited my digestive needs without coordinating with anyone else's schedule. I could manage my medication routine and medical appointments without having to justify or explain my healthcare decisions to family members who might question their necessity or expense. The independence was both liberating and challenging. My Crohn's required careful management of diet, stress, and sleep schedules, all of which were more difficult to maintain while job searching and living on limited savings. But the ability to prioritize my health needs without negotiating with family members who didn't fully understand or appreciate the complexities of chronic illness management felt like a revelation. My job search in communications and nonprofit work was progressing slowly but steadily. The economic climate was challenging for recent graduates, particularly in fields that were often underfunded and competitive. But I was getting interviews, building professional connections, and gradually understanding what employers in my field valued and expected from candidates. The financial pressure was significant, but manageable as long as I was careful with expenses and maintained my part-time work at a local bookstore that provided some income while allowing flexibility for job interviews and medical appointments. My small emergency savings account gave me a buffer for unexpected expenses, and I had calculated that I could maintain this lifestyle for approximately 6 months before making more dramatic changes to my living situation or career search strategy. My medical care during this period was being managed through a combination of my parents' insurance coverage, which I could maintain as a dependent until age 26, and careful budgeting for copays and medications that weren't fully covered. My Crohn's was relatively stable, requiring monthly specialist visits and ongoing prescription management, but not emergency interventions or major treatment changes that would create additional financial pressure. The relationship with my parents during this period had settled into a comfortable pattern of weekly phone calls and occasional family dinners where we could maintain positive interactions without the daily friction that had characterized my teenage years living under their roof. My mother would ask about my job search progress and offer suggestions about networking or resume improvement. My father would provide advice about salary negotiations and benefits packages when I had promising interview opportunities. These interactions felt healthier and more balanced than our previous family dynamics because they were voluntary and limited in scope. I could appreciate my parents' advice and concern without feeling overwhelmed by their opinions or controlled by their expectations. When their suggestions didn't align with my own judgment, I could politely acknowledge their input without having to defend my decisions or manage their disappointment about my choices. Mike, during this period, was thriving in his pharmaceutical sales career and enjoying his engagement to Jessica, who had quickly become a welcome addition to our family gatherings. Jessica's presence had actually improved our family dynamics in several ways, bringing a fresh perspective and gentle humor that helped diffuse some of the tension that had historically characterized our interactions. As a nurse, Jessica understood the complexities of chronic illness management in ways that my parents never had, and she would often ask thoughtful questions about my Crohn's symptoms and treatment that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite obligation.
Her medical background also meant that she could translate some of the more technical aspects of my condition for my parents, helping them understand why certain medications or dietary restrictions were necessary rather than optional preferences. Mike seemed more relaxed and genuinely happy than I had seen him in years, and his relationship with Jessica had brought out aspects of his personality that were more mature and considerate than the self-centered behavior that had dominated his younger years. He was talking about long-term career goals, home ownership plans, and other adult responsibilities with a seriousness that suggested real personal growth. The wedding planning process had been an opportunity for positive family bonding, as my parents threw themselves into supporting Mike and Jessica's vision for their celebration. My mother had taken on the role of unofficial wedding coordinator, helping with vendor research and appointment scheduling.
My father had assumed responsibility for understanding the financial aspects of the various wedding expenses and ensuring that everything stayed within budget parameters that wouldn't create long-term financial strain for the family. I had participated in the wedding planning as much as my budget and health allowed, contributing to shower gifts and attending planning meetings when my work schedule permitted. The celebration itself had been beautiful and joyful, with Mike and Jessica clearly devoted to each other and excited about their future together. Watching them exchange vows and seeing the happiness on my parents' faces had created a sense of family unity and shared celebration that felt genuine and meaningful. The months immediately following the wedding had maintained this positive family atmosphere. Mike and Jessica had settled into their new home with enthusiasm, hosting family dinners and holiday celebrations that included both sets of parents and created opportunities for extended family bonding. Jessica's nursing schedule meant that she was often available during weekdays when my parents were free, and she had begun developing independent relationships with both my mother and father that enriched the overall family dynamic. But this period of family harmony and personal independence came to an abrupt end when the nonprofit organization, where I had been working as a contract communications specialist, lost a major grant that had funded over half of their operating budget. The news was delivered on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with the executive director explaining that budget cuts would require eliminating all contract positions immediately and reducing full-time staff by nearly 40%. The layoff was handled professionally and compassionately, with 2 weeks of severance pay and strong recommendations for future employment opportunities. But the financial impact was immediate and severe. Losing my primary source of income while maintaining the fixed expenses of rent, utilities, insurance copays, and medication costs meant that my carefully calculated 6-month financial buffer would be exhausted in approximately 10 weeks unless I could find replacement income immediately. The job market for communications professionals remained challenging, and the specific combination of nonprofit experience and chronic illness management requirements significantly limited my options for immediate employment. Many positions required irregular hours, extensive travel, or physical demands that weren't compatible with my health needs. Others offered compensation packages that wouldn't adequately cover my medical expenses, even if they provided basic living expenses. After 6 weeks of intensive job searching that produced several interviews but no offers, my financial situation had become critical. My savings account was nearly depleted, and I was facing the reality that I might not be able to maintain my independent living situation much longer without finding either immediate employment or alternative housing arrangements that would reduce my monthly expenses. The decision to move back to my parents' house was made with enormous reluctance and only after exhausting other possibilities. I had considered finding roommates to share apartment costs, but my medical needs and dietary restrictions made shared living complicated. I had explored moving to a less expensive apartment, but the cost of breaking my current lease and securing new housing would actually increase my short-term financial pressure.
When I finally called my parents to discuss the possibility of temporarily moving back home while I continued my job search, their response was immediately supportive, but carried undertones that reminded me of the complex family dynamics I had been relieved to escape. "Of course you can come home," my mother had said warmly. "Your room is always here for you when you need it." But her follow-up comments revealed the subtle condescension that I had forgotten during our recent positive interactions. "Sometimes these career experiments don't work out the way we hope, and there's no shame in regrouping and trying a more practical approach." She had continued, "Maybe this is an opportunity to reconsider some of the advice your father and I offered about more stable career paths." The implication was clear. My independent living experiment and career focus on nonprofit communications work had been indulgent choices that predictably hadn't provided adequate financial security. Moving back home wasn't simply a temporary response to economic circumstances beyond my control, but rather evidence that my parents' more conservative career advice had been correct all along. My father's response was similarly supportive, but tinged with judgment about my financial planning and career strategy decisions. "We always said this house would be here if things didn't work out," he had said. "Maybe you can use this time to think about building a more sustainable foundation for the future." The phrase, "if things didn't work out," suggested that my period of independence had been a failure rather than a normal part of young adult development that had been interrupted by economic circumstances beyond my control. The emphasis on building a more sustainable foundation implied that my previous choices had been irresponsible rather than simply unlucky in timing. Despite these subtle criticisms, I accepted my parents' offer to move back home temporarily because my alternatives were limited, and my medical needs made financial instability particularly dangerous. Having adequate housing and family support while managing a chronic illness and job search seemed more important than maintaining pride about my independence or avoiding family dynamics that I found challenging. The plan I proposed was straightforward and designed to minimize disruption to my parents' established routines while giving me time to find stable employment and save money for another independent living arrangement. I would contribute to household expenses as soon as I found employment, help with household tasks and responsibilities, and focus intensively on job searching during my temporary stay. What I hadn't anticipated was how much my return would disrupt the comfortable family dynamics that had developed during Mike and Jessica's engagement and early marriage period, and how my presence would trigger a return to the favoritism and manipulation patterns that had characterized my childhood and teenage years. Part 6. The immediate trigger event. My return to the family home in Riverside coincided almost perfectly with the most significant crisis Mike had faced in his adult life, creating a volatile situation that would ultimately expose years of hidden family dysfunction and financial deception. What began as my temporary housing
arrangement while job searching quickly became the backdrop for a series of events that would force every family member to confront truths they had spent decades avoiding. The crisis began on a humid Thursday morning in late June, just 3 weeks after I had moved back into my childhood bedroom. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, responding to job application emails and preparing for a phone interview scheduled for that afternoon, when Mike burst through the front door with an expression of panic and devastation that immediately filled the house with tension. Jessica was supposed to be working her regular day shift at Riverside General Hospital, but she had called in sick that morning with what Mike had assumed was a minor stomach bug or fatigue from her demanding nursing schedule. Instead of resting at home as he had expected, Jessica had driven to Dr. Martinez's dental office where my mother worked part-time, ostensibly to discuss dental insurance questions related to a procedure she was considering. What Jessica had actually discovered at Dr. Martinez's office was my mother engaged in what could only be described as creative bookkeeping practices that involved manipulating patient billing records and insurance claims in ways that generated additional income for both the dental practice and my mother personally. The conversation Jessica overheard between my mother and Dr. Martinez revealed a sophisticated system of billing irregularities that had been operating for years, generating thousands of dollars in fraudulent insurance reimbursements. But the dental office fraud was only the beginning of what Jessica uncovered that morning. Her nursing background had given her enough understanding of medical billing and insurance procedures to recognize that the practices she witnessed were not simply administrative errors or gray area interpretations of billing rules, but deliberate fraud that could result in serious legal consequences for everyone involved. More importantly, Jessica's position as a healthcare professional meant that she was legally obligated to report the billing fraud she had witnessed, creating an immediate crisis that threatened not only my mother's employment and legal standing, but potentially my father's insurance industry career and the family's financial stability. Mike's panic was entirely justified. If Jessica reported what she had seen, the investigation would likely extend beyond the dental office to examine my mother's other financial activities, including her role in managing our family's various accounts and her access to my medical fund. The scrutiny could expose years of financial irregularities and potentially result in criminal charges that would destroy my parents' reputation in the community and their ability to maintain their current lifestyle. But Mike's immediate concern wasn't about the legal or financial consequences of my mother's fraudulent activities. His primary worry was about how Jessica's discovery would affect his marriage and his own reputation within his professional and social circles. As a pharmaceutical sales representative, Mike's career depended heavily on maintaining relationships with healthcare professionals and projecting an image of integrity and trustworthiness. Having a mother-in-law who was involved in medical billing fraud could seriously damage his professional standing and potentially cost him his job. The conversation that followed Mike's arrival home that evening was unlike any family discussion I had ever witnessed. Instead of the usual careful management of family image and systematic protection of Mike's interests, everyone was forced to confront the reality that years of hidden financial activities were about to be exposed by the one person whose opinion my parents truly cared about impressing. My mother arrived home from work 20 minutes after Mike, her face ashen and her usual composed demeanor completely shattered. The woman who had spent decades maintaining perfect appearances and managing family reputation was suddenly faced with the possibility that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble in the most public and humiliating way possible. Linda's first instinct was to minimize and deny, using the same tactics she had employed for years when confronted with uncomfortable family truths. Jessica misunderstood what she saw, my mother insisted, even as her hands trembled and her voice carried none of its usual confidence. There are complicated insurance procedures that someone outside the industry wouldn't fully comprehend. But this crisis was different from the family conflicts my mother had successfully managed in the past. Jessica wasn't a family member who could be manipulated through guilt, obligation, or financial dependency. She was a healthcare professional with legal and ethical obligations that superseded family loyalty, and she possessed the technical knowledge to understand exactly what she had witnessed at Dr. Martinez's office. More importantly, Jessica held a position of moral authority within our family that my mother had never faced before. As a nurse, Jessica was regarded by everyone, including my parents, as someone whose integrity and professional judgment were beyond question. Her assessment of the billing practices couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding or exaggeration because her medical background gave her credibility that trumped my mother's attempts at explanation and denial. My father's arrival home that evening transformed the crisis from a family emergency into a full-scale catastrophe. Bob's career in insurance claims adjustment had given him extensive knowledge of fraud investigation procedures and the legal consequences of billing irregularities. He understood immediately that if Jessica reported what she had seen, the investigation would be thorough, professional, and likely to uncover additional financial activities that the family had worked years to conceal.
The conversation that took place in our living room that evening was the first honest family discussion about money and ethics that I could remember in my entire life. Without the usual protective barriers of denial and rationalization, the scope of my family's financial deception began to emerge in all its complexity and callousness. My father's attempts to explain and justify my mother's activities revealed a level of financial desperation and poor decision-making that none of us had fully understood. The additional income from the dental office billing fraud hadn't been motivated by greed or lifestyle inflation, but rather by the enormous financial pressure created by years of supporting Mike's expenses and lifestyle while maintaining the appearance of middle-class stability. The medical fund theft, the retirement account withdrawals, the weekend consulting work, and now the billing fraud were all connected pieces of a financial strategy designed to ensure that Mike never experienced any reduction in support
or lifestyle, while keeping the family's mounting debt and financial instability hidden from public view. But what made this revelation particularly devastating was the realization that my parents had been living beyond their means for years, specifically to support Mike's preferences and ambitions, while simultaneously making me feel guilty about the cost of my medical care and using my health needs as justification for their increased work hours and financial stress. The irony was almost unbearable. My parents had been committing fraud to generate additional income that could support Mike's lifestyle while stealing money from my medical fund and making me feel responsible for their financial struggles. The woman who had been manipulating dental insurance claims to pay for Mike's wedding and house down payment was the same woman who regularly reminded me of how much my medications cost and how much sacrifice my health required from the family. Jessica's position in this crisis was particularly complex because she was simultaneously the family member with the most legal and ethical authority and the person whose relationship with Mike gave her the strongest motivation to protect the family from the consequences of exposure. Her medical background meant she understood both the seriousness of the fraud and the legal obligations she faced as a healthcare professional who had witnessed it. But her marriage to Mike and her genuine affection for our family created competing loyalties that made her decision about reporting the fraud much more complicated than a straightforward professional obligation. Jessica had quickly become an integral part of our family dynamics, participating in holiday celebrations, family dinners, and the kind of intimate family moments that created emotional bonds and personal investment in everyone's well-being. The discussions that took place over the following days revealed the full scope of Jessica's dilemma and the impossible position my parents' actions had created for her. As a nurse, she was professionally and legally obligated to report suspected billing fraud, particularly when she had witnessed it directly and possessed specific evidence of the irregularities. But as Mike's wife and a member of our family, reporting the fraud would likely result in criminal charges against my mother, financial ruin for my parents, loss of employment for both my father and mother, and potential professional consequences for Mike that could destroy his pharmaceutical sales career. The emotional manipulation that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in our family's long history of managing uncomfortable truths through denial and strategic pressure. My parents, who had spent decades projecting authority and moral superiority, were suddenly in the position of pleading with Jessica to prioritize family loyalty over professional ethics. My mother's appeals focused on the potential consequences for Mike's career and future financial security. You have to think about what this would do to Mike's reputation in the pharmaceutical industry, she pleaded with Jessica during one particularly intense conversation. He's worked so hard to build his professional relationships, and having this kind of scandal in his family could destroy everything he's accomplished. My father's approach was more strategic,
focusing on the legal complexities of Jessica's reporting obligations and suggesting that the billing irregularities might not meet the threshold for mandatory reporting if they were corrected and discontinued immediately. There are ways to handle this privately that would protect everyone involved while still addressing any legitimate concerns about proper procedures, he argued. But the most disturbing aspect of these family discussions was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that the fraud had been committed specifically to support Mike's lifestyle and preferences. Even while begging Jessica not to report criminal activity that had been undertaken for Mike's benefit, my parents continued to frame the situation as a general family crisis rather than the direct result of their determination to provide Mike with financial support they couldn't afford through legitimate means. The pressure on Jessica was intense and relentless, with family members taking turns presenting different arguments for why she should prioritize family protection over professional obligation. But what my parents failed to recognize was that their attempts to manipulate Jessica were actually demonstrating exactly the kind of ethical flexibility and disregard for professional responsibilities that had created the crisis in the first place. Jessica's nursing training had instilled values of integrity, accountability, and patient protection that made the idea of covering up fraud fundamentally incompatible with her personal and professional identity. The more my family pressured her to ignore what she had witnessed, the more she understood that this kind of ethical compromise was precisely what had allowed the fraud to continue for years without detection or accountability. The crisis reached its peak when Mike, desperate to protect his career and marriage, suggested that the family could make financial restitution for any billing irregularities and implement new oversight procedures that would prevent future problems, all without involving outside authorities or professional reporting requirements. His proposal was both naive and revealing. Naive because it demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of how fraud investigations work and the legal obligations that healthcare professionals face when they witness billing irregularities. Revealing because it showed that even in the face of clear criminal activity, Mike's primary concern was protecting himself from consequences, rather than addressing the underlying ethical problems that had created the crisis. But Mike's suggestion also inadvertently created the opening I had been waiting for since discovering the medical fund theft. If the family was going to discuss financial restitution and accounting for years of questionable financial activities, then every aspect of our family money management was potentially subject to examination and disclosure. Part 7. The confrontation builds. The week following Jessica's discovery of my mother's billing fraud created an atmosphere of barely contained crisis that permeated every interaction in our household. What had begun as my temporary return home while job searching had suddenly become a front-row seat to the systematic unraveling of decades of family deception, financial manipulation, and ethical compromise that reached far beyond anything I had previously imagined. The daily routine of our house had been completely disrupted by the ongoing discussions about how to manage Jessica's knowledge of the billing fraud while protecting the family from legal and professional consequences. My parents were having hushed conversations.
Behind closed doors, Mike was making frequent phone calls to friends and colleagues, seeking advice about damage control, and Jessica was notably absent from the family dinners and casual visits that had become routine during the early months of her marriage. But for me, this crisis represented an unprecedented opportunity to raise questions about our family's financial management that would have been impossible to address under normal circumstances. The billing fraud had created a context where financial transparency and accountability were suddenly urgent family priorities, making it reasonable for me to request information about my own medical fund and its management over the years. The conversation I had been planning since discovering the theft of my medical money finally took place on a Tuesday evening when the entire family was gathered in our living room, ostensibly to discuss strategies for resolving the crisis with Jessica. The discussion had been going in circles for over an hour, with my parents alternating between minimizing the significance of the billing irregularities and emphasizing the devastating consequences that would result from public exposure. Mike had been arguing that the family needed to present a united front and demonstrate their commitment to resolving any financial problems through private restitution rather than involving outside authorities. "We need to show Jessica that we're taking this seriously and that we have a plan for making things right," he insisted. "If we can prove that we're committed to transparency and accountability, maybe she'll understand that reporting this wouldn't serve anyone's best interests." The irony of Mike lecturing the family about transparency and accountability while sitting in a room where he had participated in stealing my medical fund for his wedding expenses was too much for me to tolerate silently. "If we're talking about financial transparency and accountability," I said, interrupting the ongoing discussion, "then I think we should start by reviewing the management of my medical fund over the past few years." The immediate silence that followed my statement was profound and telling. My father's expression shifted from thoughtful problem-solving to something approaching panic, while my mother's face flushed with the kind of guilty embarrassment that confirmed my suspicions about the scope of their financial deception. Mike's reaction was the most revealing because instead of appearing confused or curious about why I would raise questions about my medical fund during a discussion of the billing fraud, his expression showed the immediate recognition of someone who knew exactly what I was referring to and understood the implications of bringing it into the open. "Emma, this isn't the time for unrelated financial discussions," my father said, quickly, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he typically used when attempting to control family conversations and redirect them away from uncomfortable topics. "We need to focus on the immediate crisis with Jessica and find a solution that protects everyone's interests." But I had spent too many years being redirected and silenced when I attempted to raise questions about fairness and family financial priorities to be deterred by my father's familiar attempts at conversational control. "Actually, I think this is exactly the time for this discussion," I replied, maintaining eye contact with him despite the intimidation tactics I had learned to recognize and resist. "If we're going to talk about financial restitution and accountability, then I want to understand what happened to the money that was specifically designated for my medical care." The question hung in the air like a challenge that could no longer be avoided or deflected through the usual family strategies of denial and topic redirection. My parents exchanged the kind of meaningful look that I had witnessed countless times throughout my childhood, their silent communication system attempting to coordinate a response that would minimize damage while maintaining their control over the family narrative. My mother's attempt at explanation was predictably evasive and patronizing. "Emma, your medical fund has always been carefully managed to ensure that you receive the care you need," she said in the tone she typically used when explaining complex adult matters to someone she considered too young or naive to understand the full picture. "There are sophisticated financial strategies involved in medical expense planning that require balancing immediate needs with long-term security." The condescending explanation was almost identical to the responses I had received throughout my life whenever I questioned family financial decisions or asked for transparency about money that directly affected my well-being. But this time, I had documentation that contradicted their carefully crafted explanations, and I was prepared to challenge their narrative with specific facts rather than general concerns. "I'd like to see the current balance and recent transaction history for the medical fund," I said, maintaining the calm but determined tone I had practiced for this confrontation. "Since we're talking about financial transparency, I think I have a right to understand how money designated for my healthcare has been managed." My father's response revealed just how desperate he was to avoid this specific discussion. "Emma, you're being unreasonable and selfish," he said, using the guilt and shame tactics that had been effective in controlling my behavior throughout my childhood and teenage years. "Your family is facing a serious crisis that could affect everyone's future, and you're choosing this moment to make demands about money that has always been used for your benefit?"
The accusation of selfishness was particularly cruel given what I knew about how my medical money had actually been used. But it also demonstrated how reflexively my parents resorted to emotional manipulation when their authority was challenged. Even in the face of their own financial fraud and deception, they were attempting to make me feel guilty for requesting information about my own healthcare fund. But Mike's reaction to this exchange was the most significant, because instead of supporting my parents' attempts to deflect my questions, he appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. His expression suggested that he understood the implications of my requests for financial transparency and was beginning to realize that his participation in the medical fund theft might be exposed during this discussion. Look, maybe we should table all of these financial discussions until we've resolved the situation with Jessica, Mike said, attempting to broker a compromise that would postpone the medical fund conversation indefinitely. We're all under a lot of stress right now, and making major decisions about family finances when emotions are running high probably isn't the best approach. His suggestion was reasonable on the surface, but it revealed his awareness that the medical fund discussion posed a serious threat to his own interests and reputation. Mike was advocating for delay not because of timing concerns, but because he understood that transparency about the medical fund would expose his own participation in financial deception and potentially shift Jessica's perception of the family crisis from unfortunate billing irregularities to systematic fraud involving multiple family members. The dynamics of this conversation were unlike any family discussion I had ever experienced because, for the first time in my life, my parents were in a defensive position where their authority and credibility were seriously compromised. The billing fraud had created a context where their financial judgment and ethical standards were already under scrutiny, making it much more difficult for them to dismiss my concerns or refuse my requests for information. More importantly, the potential involvement of Jessica in these discussions meant that my parents could no longer rely on their usual strategies of family isolation and internal manipulation to control the narrative. Any financial information they provided about my medical fund might be subject to review by someone with professional medical billing experience who would understand the significance of fund mismanagement and be legally obligated to report any additional irregularities she discovered. The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents alternating between attempts to deflect my questions and efforts to minimize the significance of any financial management decisions they had made regarding my medical fund. They acknowledged that there had been some temporary reallocations of money between family accounts during periods of financial pressure, but they insisted that these transfers had always been intended as loans that would be repaid when family finances stabilized. But their explanations were vague and contradictory in ways that revealed both their dishonesty and their assumption that I lacked the financial sophistication to understand the details of what they had done. They spoke about cash flow management and strategic resource allocation as if these business terms could obscure the reality that they had stolen money designated for my health care to pay for Mike's lifestyle expenses. The most frustrating aspect of their responses was the continued insistence that their financial decisions had always been motivated by concern for my welfare and the family's overall financial security. Even while admitting to transferring money from my medical fund, they maintained that these decisions had been made with my best interest in mind and represented responsible financial planning rather than betrayal of my healthcare security. "We have always prioritized your medical needs above everything else in this family," my mother insisted during one particularly heated exchange. "Every financial decision we've made has been evaluated based on how it would affect your ability to receive proper treatment. If we moved money temporarily from your medical account, it was only because we were confident that your immediate medical needs were secure." The assertion was not only false, based on the documentation I had discovered, but it was also deeply insulting given the years I had spent feeling guilty about the financial burden my medical needs placed on the family. My mother was claiming that my health care had been the family's top financial priority, while simultaneously admitting that she had transferred my medical money to pay for other expenses she considered more important. But the most significant development during this confrontation was Mike's growing recognition that his own interests were not aligned with his parents' strategy of denial and minimization.
As the discussion continued and my questions became more specific, Mike began to understand that his participation in the medical fund theft was likely to be exposed regardless of how successfully my parents managed to deflect immediate accountability. His pharmaceutical sales career had given him experience with crisis management and damage control that my parents lacked, and he understood that the current strategy of evasion and partial admissions was likely to make the eventual exposure more damaging rather than less so. If Jessica was going to learn about the medical fund theft through an ongoing investigation of family finances, it would be better for Mike if he heard about his involvement directly from him rather than discovering it through external scrutiny. More importantly, Mike was beginning to realize that his long-term interests might be better served by distancing himself from my parents' financial deception rather than defending it. As a healthcare industry professional married to a nurse, his reputation and career prospects would be better protected if he could demonstrate that he had been an unwilling participant in family financial problems rather than an active collaborator in ongoing fraud. The shift in Mike's position became apparent when he stopped supporting my parents' attempts to end the medical fund discussion and instead began asking questions about the specific transactions and timelines I was referencing. Emma, if you have concerns about how your medical fund has been managed, I think we should address them directly rather than avoiding the conversation, he said, his tone suggesting genuine interest in resolving the issue rather than simply defending the family position. His apparent support for transparency was motivated by self-interest rather than genuine concern for my welfare, but it represented the first time in my adult life that Mike had taken a public position that contradicted my parents' preferred narrative. The billing fraud crisis had created a situation where Mike's individual interests diverged from my parents' collective strategy, opening the possibility for a different kind of family dynamic than the united front that had historically protected him from accountability. But what Mike didn't yet understand was that my investigation of the medical fund had revealed the scope of his personal involvement in the financial deception, and that his attempts to position himself as a supportive family member seeking transparency would be contradicted by the evidence I had gathered about his active participation in stealing my healthcare money. Part 8, the breaking point, the attack. The confrontation that would finally shatter our family's carefully maintained facade began on a sweltering Saturday morning in early July when the combination of summer heat, financial stress, and forced proximity in our house created an atmosphere so tense that even routine interactions felt like potential explosions waiting to happen. Jessica had been absent from family gatherings for over a week since discovering my mother's billing fraud, and her avoidance had only heightened the intensity of the unspoken tensions in our home.
Our house had created an unbearable anxiety for Mike that was affecting every aspect of his behavior and mood. He had been making increasingly desperate attempts to convince Jessica to attend family dinners and maintain normal social interactions while the billing fraud situation remained unresolved. But her continued absence was forcing him to confront the possibility that his marriage might not survive the financial and ethical scandals that were threatening to engulf our family. The breaking point came when Mike arrived at our house that morning for what he had planned as a casual visit, but which quickly escalated into the most destructive family confrontation I had ever witnessed. He had clearly been drinking, despite the early hour, and his usual charming facade had been replaced by a combination of desperation, rage, and self-pity that made him almost unrecognizable from the confident, successful person he had always projected himself to be. "Jessica won't even talk to me about coming to Sunday dinner tomorrow," Mike announced as he walked into the kitchen where I was having breakfast and reviewing job application materials. "She says she needs more time to think about the situation, but I know what that really means. She's planning to report Mom to the authorities, and she's trying to figure out how to protect herself from being connected to our family when the investigation starts." His assessment of Jessica's intentions was probably accurate, but his assumption that I would provide sympathetic support for his marital problems was badly miscalculated. I had spent the previous week researching the legal and professional obligations that healthcare workers faced when they witnessed billing fraud, and I understood that Jessica's position was far more complicated and ethically challenging than my family had been acknowledging. maybe Jessica is taking time to think because she's trying to balance her professional obligations with her personal loyalty to you, I suggested, attempting to provide a perspective that acknowledged the legitimate difficulty of Jessica's situation rather than simply viewing her hesitation as betrayal of family interests. Mike's response was immediate and revealing of just how much pressure he was feeling from the potential collapse of his carefully constructed adult life. "You know what, Emma? I'm getting really tired of your attitude lately," he said, moving closer to where I was sitting at the kitchen table in a way that felt physically intimidating. "Ever since you moved back home, you've been stirring up problems and making everything more difficult for everyone." The accusation was both false and strategically calculated to shift blame for the family crisis away from the people who had actually committed fraud and theft toward the family member who had been victimized by their deception. Mike was attempting to use the same manipulation tactics that had been effective throughout our childhood, casting me as the troublemaker whose unreasonable demands and selfish concerns were disrupting family harmony. But his suggestion that my presence in the house was the source of our family's problems was particularly cruel given that I was living at home specifically because of financial circumstances beyond my control, while the actual crisis facing our family had been created by years of financial deception undertaken specifically to support his lifestyle and preferences. "I'm not stirring up problems, Mike," I replied, standing up from the table to reduce the physical intimidation factor of his positioning. "I'm asking questions about my own medical fund that should have been answered honestly years ago. If those questions are making things more difficult, it's because the answers reveal problems that already existed, not because I'm creating new problems by asking them." My response was calm and logical, but it directly challenged Mike's preferred narrative about the source of our family's difficulties and his own role in creating them. Throughout his life, Mike had been surrounded by family members who consistently prioritized his comfort and success over their own principles, and he had apparently expected that pattern to continue with his wife. But what made his comments particularly offensive was the casual dismissal of Jessica's professional integrity and the implied expectation that she should compromise her ethical standards to protect him from the consequences of our family's financial deception. Mike was essentially arguing that Jessica's marriage vows should supersede her professional responsibilities, and that her love for him should make her willing to become complicit in covering up criminal activity. "Jessica isn't the problem here, Mike," I said, feeling my anger beginning to override the careful emotional control I had been maintaining throughout the recent family crisis. "The problem is that our family has been involved in fraud and financial deception for years, and now someone with actual integrity is being asked to choose between doing the right thing and protecting people who have been lying to her since the day she met them." My response was more direct and confrontational than I had intended, but the combination of stress from my job search, frustration with my family's ongoing deception, and outrage at Mike's selfish response to Jessica's ethical dilemma had pushed me past my usual careful management of family dynamics. Mike's reaction was swift and vicious in a way that revealed just how much of his anger about the crisis was actually directed toward me, rather than the external circumstances threatening his lifestyle and reputation. "You know what, Emma? I'm getting really tired of your attitude lately," he said, moving closer to where I was sitting at the kitchen table in a way that felt physically intimidating. "Ever since you moved back home, you've been stirring up problems and making everything more difficult for everyone."
Stake in maintaining the deception. The family has made sacrifices to support your medical needs for years, and if some of that money was used for other family priorities during times when your medical expenses were lower, that's just good financial planning. You're acting like we stole money from you when the reality is that we've been supporting your medical care for almost a decade while also trying to build a stable future for the whole family. The statement was remarkable for both its dishonesty and its revelation of how Mike had rationalized his participation in stealing my medical money. He was simultaneously acknowledging that money from my medical fund had been used for other family priorities during times when my medical expenses were lower, while denying that this constituted theft. And he was framing his wedding and house down payment as investments in the whole family, rather than personal benefits he had received at my expense.
But most revealing was his use of the word we when describing the financial decisions about my medical fund, confirming that he had been an active participant in those decisions rather than simply a beneficiary who was unaware of how his support was being funded. Mike, I know exactly how much money was transferred from my medical fund to pay for your wedding and house down payment, I said, deciding that the time for indirect confrontation had passed and that direct disclosure of my knowledge was necessary to end the ongoing deception. I've seen the bank statements and the transfer records, and I know that you were involved in the discussions about taking my healthcare money for your personal expenses. The impact of my statement was immediate and dramatic. Mike's face went through a series of expressions that revealed his shock at being confronted with specific evidence of his involvement, his panic about the implications of my knowledge, and his anger at being forced to acknowledge what he had apparently hoped could remain hidden indefinitely. "You've been going through family financial records?" he asked, his voice carrying a combination of outrage and fear that confirmed my understanding of both the scope of the deception and his personal stake in keeping it concealed. "You have no right to snoop through private family documents. Those records contain confidential information about everyone's finances, not just yours." His attempt to frame my investigation as a violation of family privacy, rather than a legitimate inquiry into the management of my own healthcare fund, was both hypocritical and legally absurd. But it revealed his desperation to regain control of a situation that was rapidly moving beyond his ability to manage through manipulation and intimidation. More significantly, his focus on the privacy of family financial records rather than the substance of what those records revealed, confirmed that he knew the documentation would support my accusations about the medical fund theft and his participation in it. "Mike, that was my money," I said, feeling the full weight of years of suppressed anger and betrayal finally breaking through the careful emotional control I had maintained throughout my adult life. That money was contributed by Mom and Dad specifically for my medical care, and you knew that when you participated in the decision to steal it for your wedding. You looked me in the eye at your reception and thanked me for being such a supportive sister, knowing that your celebration was being funded partly by money that was supposed to ensure my health security. The accusation was emotionally devastating and personally humiliating for Mike in ways that struck at the core of his self-image as a successful, ethical person who deserved the support and admiration he had always received from family and friends. Being confronted with the reality that his wedding celebration had been funded through theft from his chronically ill sister's medical fund challenged every aspect of the narrative he had constructed about his accomplishments and his character. His response was the most violent and uncontrolled behavior I had ever witnessed from him, revealing a capacity for physical aggression that I had never suspected despite years of emotional manipulation and verbal intimidation. Mike lunged forward and grabbed my shoulders, shaking me with enough force to make my teeth rattle while screaming about my ingratitude and selfishness in ways that demonstrated complete loss of emotional control. "You ungrateful bitch," he yelled, his face contorted with rage, and only inches from mine. "After everything this family has done for you, after all the money we've spent on your medical care, you're going to destroy everyone's life because you're jealous that I've been more successful than you'll ever be?" The physical attack was shocking and terrifying, but what made it even more disturbing was the revelation of the depth of resentment and hostility Mike had apparently harbored toward me for years while maintaining a facade of brotherly affection and concern. His accusations about jealousy and ingratitude suggested that he had never viewed my medical needs as legitimate health needs, requirements deserving of family support, but rather as selfish demands that interfered with resources that should have been available for his benefit.
The attack continued as Mike pushed me backward against the kitchen counter with enough force to knock the breath out of my lungs and send pain shooting through my back where it connected with the granite edge. Jessica is going to ruin everything because of your stupid questions about money that was used to help the family succeed, he continued, his grip on my shoulders tightening until his fingers left bruises on my arms. You could have just kept your mouth shut and been grateful for everything we've done for you, but instead you had to start problems that are going to destroy my marriage and my career. Everything that happens to this family is going to be your fault because you couldn't appreciate what you had. The physical assault was accompanied by a psychological attack that revealed the extent to which Mike blamed me for the crisis facing our family, despite the fact that the problems had been created entirely by his and my parents' decisions to commit fraud and steal from my medical fund. In his mind, the real problem wasn't that they had engaged in criminal activity, but that I had discovered it and was refusing to remain silent about it. But what made the attack even more devastating was the realization that Mike's anger wasn't primarily about the potential exposure of his participation in financial deception. His rage was fundamentally about the disruption of family dynamics that had always prioritized his interests and protected him from accountability, and his fear that those patterns might finally be coming to an end. Part 9. Authority Cover-Up Attempt. The immediate aftermath of Mike's physical attack on me in our kitchen was a masterclass in family crisis management that revealed just how sophisticated and well-practiced my parents had become at protecting Mike from consequences while minimizing incidents that threatened the family's carefully maintained public image. My mother arrived home from her Saturday morning tennis game less than 10 minutes after Mike had stormed out of the house, leaving me shaken and bruised but grateful that his loss of control hadn't escalated into more serious violence. Linda walked through the front door with her usual post-exercise energy, calling out cheerful greetings and commenting on the beautiful weather, completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred during her absence. Her demeanor changed immediately when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with obvious finger-shaped bruises on my shoulders and arms, holding an ice pack against my back where it had connected with the granite counter during Mike's attack. The transformation from cheerful suburbanite to damage control specialist was so rapid and complete that it revealed this wasn't the first time she had been faced with evidence of Mike's capacity for physical violence. "Emma, what happened to you?" she asked, but her tone carried more concern about managing a crisis than genuine worry about my welfare. Before I could respond, she was already scanning the kitchen for evidence of what had occurred and calculating how to minimize whatever situation she was about to discover. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.